Hey SM3, in 10.3 we're going to be talking about collecting data. Now, I think most are pretty happy so far with uh, after 10.2. There hasn't been a whole lot of computations and all that stuff, so hopefully 10.3 continues that streak for just a little bit longer. But 10.3 we're going to be talking about collecting pretty much like a well, in statistics, statistics is the science of collecting, organizing, and interpreting data. And in this one, we're kind of going to focus on the collecting part. So, what are ways to collect data, and what's the best? What are methods that we can use to collect data, and what would be best for each one? Sometimes it's better to do one or the other, but so we're going to be talking about that today. So the most common, and honestly, this is the the preferred way, which is through a random sample. And a random sample is where each member of a population. So say you have a population, and we talked about last time the difference between population and sample. But to gather a sample, the best way would be to take the population and just randomly select people where everybody has an equal chance of being selected. Okay, so in a random sample, each member, so each member of a population has an equal has an has an equal chance of being selected. And we'll talk a little bit later about bias, but think about random sample. The reason why random sample is preferred is because it's so unbiased, um, and it's most likely to be representative of a population. Okay, so that's why random sample is preferred. So I guess we can write that as well. Preferred is most preferred. Okay, so most preferred option would be to use a random sample. But let's see what other options are available. Um, so first, let's talk about a self-selected sample. So in a self-selected sample, this is where members of the population volunteer for the sample. So you pose a question um, or post a question, and this is where you get volunteer responses to the question. So members of a population. So members of a population can volunteer to be in the sample. Okay, so the thing about self-selecting samples, though, is that again some bias can be presented, and it might not be representative of a population because usually people that volunteer might be people that feel a little bit more strongly about the issue, and so you might get a response that is a little bit um, more heartfelt, I guess. But that's just a potential sampling error that you can come across, in that you're not really getting everyone's opinion, and random opinion could just people that feel a little bit more strongly about the issue. So you can see here you have these figures up here raising their hand. So this is the population, right? And then the sample would be those that just volunteer. Another method would be a systematic sample. A systematic sample is a rule. So a rule is used. So it's guided by a rule. A rule is used to select members of a population So a rule is used to select members of a population, like selecting every other. Now, this could be used as a fairly way to use like a random sample. It's pretty random. But it's where, so like in this figure you can see that every other person's highlighted, showing that you're selecting every other person. It could be, the rule though, doesn't have to be that. It could be every 2 people, every 3 people, so on and so forth. So you could hand out a survey to somebody coming into a store. You can hand out or ask a question to every 2 people coming into the store, or you could see the color of a car. Every 3 cars that pass by your house, you're gonna write down the color of every third car. So that it's giving yourself a rule to how you can select members of the population. So that is systematic sample. Next is a stratified sample. In a stratified sample, a population is divided into smaller groups. So they're divided into smaller groups that share a similar characteristic. Am I spelling this right? Similar. I am not spelling that right. So they share a similar characteristic. A sample is then randomly selected from each group. So population is divided into smaller groups that share a similar characteristic. A sample is then randomly selected from each group. So what would be a good example of something like this could be like a high school. You could divide the high school into classes. You could say this is a class of sophomore. This is a class of juniors and seniors. And you can go ahead and do a random sample in each category, in each group. So this would be a stratified sample. And it doesn't have to be something like this. You can do a group of, you can say, males and females. So males and females, something like that, or so on and so forth. But you separate it into groups by common characteristic, similar characteristic, and then randomly sample each group. Okay. Another one would be a cluster sample. So in a cluster sample, a population is divided into groups, so just like a stratified. So a population is divided into groups called clusters. um, called clusters, and all the members in one group so all the members in one or more of the clusters are selected. So population is divided into groups called clusters. All the members in one or more of clusters are selected. So you can see here that we have different clusters like this, different groups, and you can see that in one of the groups you have all of them being selected. So depending on how many clusters that you could have multiple of the clusters selected as well. So you could have 2 if you needed to, but that's a cluster. So divided into groups, and all the members in one of the groups are selected. And then last but not least, the convenience sample. This is where only members of a population who are easy to reach are selected. So this is pretty much like the lazy man sample. Just whichever population or whichever members of the population are easy to reach out or easier to get a response from, you're going to survey. There's no strategy towards it. It's just you're just sampling who's ever nearest to you or something like that. So it's just a lazy man sample. Okay. Now let's go through some examples here and see which type of sample it's referring to. Okay, so you want to determine whether students in your school like the new design of the school's website. Identify the type of sample being described. So there are students in the school and you want to get their opinion on the new design of the school website. So look at these samples and see what type they are. So you list all the students alphabetically and choose every 6th student. Choose every 6th student. Now, because you are using a rule, so come up here, one that uses a rule would be a systematic sample. So you're using a rule in order to select a student. So this one would be a systematic sample. Alright. You mail in questionnaires and use only the questionnaires that are returned. Okay, so you're trying to email or mail out people survey questions, but you only get questionnaires back from those that respond to it. So that to me sounds like it's somebody volunteering to respond to it. So this one would be a self-selected sample. So a self-selected sample. You ask all the students in your algebra class. All the students in your algebra class. Now, this might fall under a couple of them. Like you could say it's a group of students, but the thing is, you're not actually separating it into different groups. You're just taking it from one algebra class. So if you were to say, let's take algebra, science, English classes or something like that, and then you could probably classify this as a stratified sample or a cluster sample. But in here it's just saying you ask all the students in your algebra class. So this to me sounds like a lazy man sample, the convenience sample, because you're just giving it to those that might be next to you or readily available. So I'd call this a convenience sample. Okay. You randomly select 2 students from each classroom. Okay, so you have all these classrooms spread out across Timpview High School, and you're just taking 2 from each classroom. 2, 2, 2, 2. Okay, now that wouldn't be a cluster because you're not selecting all the students in some of the classrooms. You're just taking groups, okay, classrooms, and you're selecting 2 students, 2 students, 2 students from each one. So this would be a stratified. So this would be a stratified sample. Okay. Okay. So how about in these exercises right here, you go through them and see if you can identify them on your own. So I'll give the answers in just a second, but I'd prefer if you could go through and give it just a shot, see if you can come up with the right sample. So pause the video right now, and when you're done, unpause it and you'll have the answers. Okay, so hopefully you had a second to do that. So for 3, you should get something. This should sound more like a systematic sample. So systematic. For 2, this one would represent something like a self-selected. And then for 3, a stratified. That one would be stratified. Okay, now we got more definitions on the way. Now let's talk about bias. So bias is an error. Let's define this. Bias is an error that results So it's an error that results in a misrepresentation So an error that results in a misrepresentation of a population. An error that results in a misrepresentation of the population. So in order to obtain reliable information and draw accurate conclusions, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get reliable information and make a conclusion about the population that is accurate. It's important that we select an unbiased sample. An unbiased sample is representative of a population. So an unbiased sample is representative is a representative of the population. It's representative of the population that you want info about. Okay? And a sample that overrepresents or underrepresents a part of the population is a biased sample. So if you do get a sample that is biased, this means that the sample overrepresents or underrepresents So over or under represents a part of the population. We don't want overrepresentation. We don't want to underrepresent the population. So if we do, then that sample is biased. And then unbiased means that it is accurately representative of the population. Okay, So let's try and identify bias in some of our samples here. So identify the type of sample and explain why the sample is biased. A news organization asks its viewers to participate in an online poll about bullying. One more time, a news organization asks its viewers to participate in an online poll about bullying. So first recognize what type of a sample this is. So you're asking the viewers, which means the viewers have to voluntarily respond, right? So this would be an example of a self-selected sample. So the viewers can choose whether to participate in the poll. Now, this means that the sample is biased because people who go online and respond to the poll are more likely to have a strong opinion about bullying. So that's why it would be, this might represent, or this might give you a biased response, okay? So because the sample came by self-selection, the sample would be biased because people to respond will most likely have strong opinions. Okay. And so it might skew, it might underrepresent, it might overrepresent how the actual population feels, because people get to self-select how they respond, and so to respond and how to respond. Okay. Alright, for B, a computer science teacher wants to know how students at a school most often access the internet. The teacher asks students in one of the computer science classes. One more time. A computer science teacher wants to know how students at the school, so that would be the population, most often access the internet. The teacher asks students in one of the computer science classrooms. So first of all, what type of a sample would this be? So the school is the population, the sample is the teacher's, one of the teacher's classroom, computer science class. Now that would be a lazy man sample, a convenience sample. So a convenience sample might provide bias because other students in the school might not have the opportunity to be chosen. And so in that case, this would be, and again, so it might overrepresent the population here because you're asking students of a computer science class, so maybe they access the internet quite a bit relative to other students in the school. So the response, the sample, would probably overrepresent what the actual population feels. So because the sample is from convenience, most of the school doesn't get to respond. Okay. Now there are a couple more examples here. So example 4 and example 5. That again, I'd like you to pause the video, take a shot at these questions. See if you can explain why the sample is biased. So explain the type of sample and why the sample is biased. So do that for me, pause the video, and whenever you unpause it, I'll have the answers. Okay. So number 4, this would be a sampling technique. It would be a convenience sample. First of all, and the sample would probably be biased because the employees who use the lounge room would probably have a strong opinion about the lounge room. Okay, and then for 5, this would probably be an example of a self-selected sample. Okay, and why this might be biased is because only those viewers with strong opinions on the presidential candidates, would be likely to say something or respond to the survey. Okay. Now let's talk about methods of collecting data. There are several ways to collect data for statistical study. The objective of the study often dictates the best method for collecting the data. Okay, first is the method of experiment. Okay, so an experiment. So in an experiment, this method of collecting data imposes a treatment on individuals in order to collect data on their response to the treatment. The treatment may be a medical treatment, or it can be any action, that might affect a variable in the experiment. Such as adding methanol to gasoline, and then measuring the effects its effects on fuel efficiency. Okay, so long definition there. Okay, so it's like conducting an experiment. So think of just something like any experiment that you've done, and you're trying to observe its effects. So, as just an example popping in my mind, so I recently made a keyboard. Um, in my keyboard, I tried different switches to see how the switches would sound and see how they would feel. Now, one of an example of an experiment it would be to for me I would lube the switch. So lubing a switch can sometimes make a switch more quiet and more smooth, and so that would be an experiment of me seeing the difference between a switch that is lubed and switches that are not lubed. So that's just an experiment that I impose. I impose a treatment on something, and I'm trying to observe its effect on the variable. Okay, so that's an experiment. Next on the list is an observational study. So, observational study. An observational study observes individuals and measures variables without controlling the individual or their environment. This type of study is used when it is difficult to control or isolate the variable being studied, or when it may be unethical to subject people to a certain treatment or to withhold them or to withhold it from them. Okay. So it's basically just observe the effects of something. So you're not trying to influence the variable in one way or another. You're basically just seeing how someone might respond or how something might respond to something. You're not giving it anything to change how it might be. So you're just there to merely observe the effects. You're not trying to control anything in it. So that's an observational study. Okay. Next one is a survey. And a survey is an investigation So it's an investigation of one or more characteristics of a population. In a survey, every member of a sample is asked one or more questions. Okay. So a survey is an investigation of one or more characteristics of a population, and in a survey, every member of a sample is asked one or more questions. So these are ones that we've been talking about. This is a method of collecting data that there are different types of surveys. So we just talked about the different types of surveys that we did. There's a self-selected sample, systematic sample, stratified sample, cluster sample, convenience sample, and so on and so forth. So I guess those would be examples of survey. You're trying to find or ask a population. You're going to ask them questions to collect data about a characteristic. And last but not least is a simulation. So simulation, we actually saw an example of a simulation last time, or you should have seen it in your homework, where we talked about rolling a die, spinning a spinner. These are simulations. So a simulation uses a model to reproduce the conditions of a situation or process so that the simulated outcomes closely match the real world outcomes. Simulations allow they allow you to study simulations, or not simulations, situations. Allow you to study situations that are impractical or dangerous to create in real life. Okay. So simulation is like, I think a lot of times people, whenever we're talking about a simulation, they use like a software or something that can randomly generate an example of it. So you could say, like last time we talked about rolling a die, and we talked about simulations that would involve rolling a die. So we talked about rolling a die. Whenever you're using it as a simulation, you could use something like Excel or a random number generator that randomly selects a number from 1 to 6. So this simulates the the motion of getting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or a 6. And so you can, and the thing is about software is that you can simulate multiple rolls, or you can even do something like flipping a coin, or again like spinning a spinner. So that's an example of running a simulation. It mostly relies on using a type of software to do so. And by doing this, you reproduce the conditions of the simulation that kind of matches what it would look like in the real world, but it would be impractical to do that many those it would be impractical to, like, say, run 100 simulations of rolling a die 50 times. It would take up a lot of time, and you don't have the time or the means to do that. So just run a simulation in a software that recreates that situation. Okay, so let's go through some examples. So identify the method of data collection in each situation. So a researcher records whether people at a gas station use hand sanitizer. So he is, I would think in this case he's just merely observing the effect, right? So there's hand sanitizer at the gas station and just wants to see who uses it or not, and how many people, so how many people that come into the store use the hand sanitizer. And so that would be an observational study. B. A landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with a regular fertilizer mix and 20 lawns with a new organic fertilizer. The landscaper then compares the lawns after 10 weeks and determines which fertilizer is better. So this sounds like an experiment. You're trying to test out you're using a treatment of that on some lawns. Okay, so this one would be experiment. Okay, I'll go through these two. So example 6, example 7. So in example 6, a researcher records whether shoppers at a grocery store buy magazines at the checkout aisles while waiting in line to check out. I would classify that as an observational study. He's just merely observing effects, so not trying to control anything. Number 7, a meteorologist uses a computer model to track the trajectory of a hurricane. So a meteorologist uses a computer model to track the trajectory of a hurricane. I would say a simulation. He can't really see the effects. The effects haven't happened, but he's trying to simulate it using software or something like that. So yeah, I would say this is a simulation. Okay. Let's go through this last section right here. Recognizing bias in survey questions. Okay. So we talked about surveys right up here. So a survey is an investigation of one or more characteristics of a population. In a survey, every member of a sample is asked one or more questions. So this is what we're going to talk about. So given a question, can we recognize the bias in said question? Okay, so when designing a survey, it's important to word survey questions so that they do not lead to a biased result. Answers to poorly worded questions may not accurately reflect the opinions or actions of those being surveyed. Questions that are flawed in a way that lead to inaccurate results are called biased questions. Okay, so questions that are flawed in a way that leads to inaccurate that leads to inaccurate results are biased questions. Okay. So, avoid questions. What to avoid? So what we will be looking for? What to avoid are questions that encourage a particular response. So questions that encourage a particular response, or questions, so avoid questions that do not, I should really preface this actually, avoid questions that, so avoid questions that do not provide enough information, so enough info to give an accurate opinion. Alright, and then avoid questions that are too sensitive, to answer truthfully, or questions that address more than one issue. Okay. So we don't want questions that encourage a particular response, are too sensitive to answer truthfully, do not provide enough info to give an accurate opinion, or address more than one issue. A lot of the times, these questions can lead to biased results. So, in this example right here, a dentist surveys his patients by asking, "Do you brush your teeth at least twice per day and floss every day?" Explain why the question may be biased or otherwise introduce bias to the survey and describe a way to correct the flaw. Okay? So let's ask this question again. Do you brush your teeth at least twice per day and floss every day? So think about what we said to avoid in questions. Encourage a particular response. Does it sound like he's trying to encourage a response or something like that? I would say no. He's not trying to encourage any sort of response one way or another. Does not provide enough information. No, I think everyone should know. Um, Assuming that we're asking, teenagers, adults, that we don't really need to provide more information. Address more than one issue. It might address more than one issue, but not generally. I think the issue is healthy teeth, right? Are too sensitive to answer truthfully. Now, let's all be honest. When we go to the dentist and the dentist always asks these type of questions, I mean, most of the time, especially when it comes to flossing every day, I'm pretty sure there are very few who live up to that expectation and standard. And so most of the time we are embarrassed. So we are sensitive to answer truthfully. Okay? So parents who brush less than twice per day or do not floss, they would probably be afraid to admit it to a dentist. So I would say that would probably be the biased question. So I mean, you guys can think of a way to improve it. I can't really honestly think of one. What the book says, they say that you could have patients answer questions about dental hygiene on paper and put it in a box. So by doing this, you kind of don't have to deal with the confrontation of a face-to-face response, but you can still probably ask the question, but leave it anonymously, and so that way they might be more able to respond truthfully to the question. Here's one more. Explain why the survey questions below might be biased or otherwise introduce bias into the survey, then describe describe the way to correct the flaw. Do you agree that our school cafeteria should switch to a healthier menu? Okay, so right off the bat, I can see that they're trying to encourage a response. Do you agree? They're not trying to say what do you think about this healthier menu option or something like that. They're just saying do you agree? So it's encouraging you to say yes to the response, okay? So you should just say should the school. You should more encourage like a yes or no answer, rather than one way or the other. So should the school cafeteria switch to a healthier menu? In this way, it's not favoring one response or the other. Okay. Alright, so that should pretty much do it for 10.3. A lot of writing, but again, not a whole lot of computations. But make sure you email me if you have any questions.